Hear ancient words of faith from the book of Genesis. I am Abraham's steward, he said. God has greatly blessed Abraham. He is now a wealthy person. God has given him flocks, herds, silver, gold, attendants, camels, and donkeys. Sarah, God's spouse, bore a son late in life, and he is Abraham's heir. Abraham swore me by an oath, saying, "You must not allow my son to marry any of the Canaanites in whose land we live. Go to the land of my mother and father, to my kin, to find a spouse for Isaac." Today, when I came to the spring, I prayed, "O God of my elder Abraham, let my journey be a successful one. Let it happen like this. Here I am at the spring, and when a young woman comes to draw water, I will ask her, 'Please let me have a drink of water from the spring.' If she answers, 'Have a drink and I will water your camels as well,' let it be that she is the woman whom God has chosen to become the spouse of Abraham's heir Isaac." Before I had finished praying, I saw Rebecca approaching the spring, shouldering her water jar. She went down to the spring to draw water, and I asked her, "May I please have a drink of water?" She immediately put the jar into the spring and said, "Drink, and I'll water your camels as well." So I drank while she watered the camels. Then I asked her about her parentage, and she replied, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, Ben-Milcah, and Nahor." Whereupon I put a ring in her nose and the bracelets on her arms, and I bowed down and I worshipped God. I praised God, the God of my elder Abraham, who led me to the right place to find the granddaughter of Abraham's brother for Isaac. Please tell me that you show this kindness and loyalty to Abraham. If not, just say so, and I will go to other places." They called Rebecca and put the question to her. She replied, "Yes, I am ready to leave." So Rebecca and her attendant went with Abraham's steward and his entourage. They blessed Rebecca and said to her, "You are our sister, and you will increase to thousands and tens of thousands. May your descendants take possession of the gates of their foes." Rebecca and her attendants got ready, then mounted their camels to follow Abraham's steward. The steward took Rebecca and they set off on their journey. Isaac had gone to live in the region of Negev and came to the well of the living one who sees me. One day toward evening he went out in the field to meditate, and as he looked around, he saw that camels were approaching. When Rebecca saw Isaac, she alighted from her camel and asked the steward, "Who is that man out there walking through the field towards us?" "That is indeed Isaac," he replied. She then covered herself with her veil. The steward recounted to Isaac all that had been done. Then Isaac led Rebekah into Sarah's tent, and she became his wife, and he loved her. That is how Isaac was comforted after the loss of his mother. For foundational stories of faith, thanks be to God.
Listen for words of faith in the gospel. What comparison can I make with this generation? They are like children shouting to others as they sit in the marketplace. "We piped you a tune, but you wouldn't dance. We sang you a dirge, but you wouldn't mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, 'He is possessed.' The chosen one comes, eating and drinking, and they say, 'This one is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' Wisdom will be vindicated by her own actions." Then Jesus prayed, "God, Creator of heaven and earth, to you I offer praise. For what you have hidden from the learned and the clever, you have revealed to the youngest children. Yes, Abba, everything is as you want it to be. Jesus continued, everything has been handed over to me by God my Abba, and no one knows the beloved except Abba, and no one knows Abba except the beloved, and anyone to whom the beloved chooses to reveal them. Come to me, all who labour and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon your shoulders and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart. Here you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. For the love of God in Jesus Christ, thanks be to God.
May I speak in the name of God, who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen. The Bible is known to many as the good book. But is it actually a good book, morally speaking? In the USA, this has become a political as well as a theological question. A Utah school district recently banned the Bible from its elementary and middle schools for what it named as vulgarity and violence. This followed a parent's complaint that the Bible has material unsuitable for children after Utah's Republican government passed a law last year banning, quotes, pornographic or indecent books from schools. It's not an isolated case. Recent conservative bans on books in the USA have been particularly aimed at education around LGBTIQA issues. But this, as we can see, can easily rebound because it draws attention to the moral ambiguities that are there in the Bible. Religious conservatives, on the one hand, often assume the scriptures to be unadulterated good news. Meanwhile, some secularists tend to assume it is bad news. But read as a whole, the Bible's reality is that it rarely offers simple black or white morality. Instead, what it does is to invite us to wrestle with its challenges and its inspirations. And it's from that wrestling that we can indeed grow, and that's the theme of our worship, I think, over these next few weeks, that we can grow in faith and in the power of God to which the scriptures witness. That is what the scriptures are about, not giving us simplistic solutions or a simple answers to our lives. We do so by deepening our sense of God, in doing so by working with and through our very human realities, not escaping from them. And that's what we see in these great stories that we are hearing at the moment of our forebears, or if you like, our elders. Remember NAIDOC week this week for our elders. What we're doing at the moment with these stories is remembering our elders of faith who were a mixture of strength and love and openness to God and other things just like ourselves. Rebecca and Isaac are center stage in our Genesis story. And the question for some people is, do they act as good role models for us? Commentators down the centuries have given different answers, especially about Rebecca. Of particular concern have been her actions in enabling one of her sons, Jacob, to gain the so-called birthright of her other son, the brother Esau. The story is told in Genesis 25, part of which we heard today, and in Genesis 27, which will be part of our readings next week. In his linking of four key foremothers in Genesis, one modern writer therefore talks of Rebekah as the conniving mother, in contrast to Eve, who he calls the mother of all the living, Sarah, remember a few weeks ago, the laughing mother, and Hagar, the crying mother. Now, as we've reflected recently about Sarah and Hagar, there's an awful lot more about those women that we might want to say. But I think Rebecca seems especially ill-served by the title of the conniving mother alone. But other modern biblical commentators have been even more scathing. Despite the lack of blood on the hands of Rebecca, Bruce Vorter called her the Lady Macbeth of the Bible. And even the usually insightful Walter Brueggemann declared Rebecca should not evoke any positive emotions from modern readers. So why are we bothering reading her today? It's a strange set and change of perspectives, because until the mid-16th century, the Christian era, that's 3/4 of our history, by the way, as Christians. Until the mid-16th century, Jewish and Christian commentators and other writers held a very positive view of Rebecca. They pointed out how Rebecca, in the biblical narrative, is personally selected by God for Isaac and as is a great mother of God's people, given a similar blessing and promise as Abraham is. She is on that level. They also affirmed how Rebecca's high standing is attested in the scriptures by her ancestry, by her beautiful appearance, by her physical strength, her moral and sexual integrity, her hospitality and her strong will, which put a lot of men and women to shame in the Bible, and her ability to shape her people's life positively, because Rebecca is a woman who is an agent in life. She is not just somebody that you just ignore or you tell what to do, because she has a terrific capacity to communicate with God directly. Like Abraham, like Moses, like the other great elders of the faith who communicate with God directly. That's important to hang on to, because some people have said something rather different. As highlighted earlier, Protestant theology and modern, what you would call prejudgments, prejudices, have typically cast Rebecca in a very different light. And it seems to have been started, bear with me, Presbyterians, with John Calvin, who rejected traditional interpretations of Rebecca and said she was not praiseworthy, but rather her attitude was ill-regulated, and in her the corruption of nature too much betrays itself. Other people built on what Calvin had to say, creating a new way of interpreting the Rebecca narratives, not least the influential commentator Matthew Henry, who asserted, quotes, as an indisputable fact, that Rebecca was a sinner who taught her son Jacob to lie and deceive. So by the 19th century, people like Charles Henry Mackintosh were alleging that, quotes, in Rebecca and Jacob, we see nature taking advantage of nature. There was no waiting on God whatever. That's a particular way of understanding grace. Now, Rebecca, it is true, with others in Genesis, are not uncomplicated role models. Nor do we need to rehabilitate pious readings of them as it were outstanding saints that we somehow have to repeat their behavior. The point is, and this is what we're exploring, I think, at this time, is how we handle the biblical texts. That we need to be aware of our own perspectives and not come to them, like, I have to say, Calvin and a lot of our tradition, in a rather surface manner, or without listening to what other people have to say and have said and might say about them. Because apart from vexed past debates about the relationship of grace to nature, and I could preach at length about that as well, these negative critiques of Rebecca seem to me to have a little bit of a touch of anti-Semitic and sexist overtones. They can easily be coupled, I think, with a lack of due regard both for the depth of Christian tradition over the centuries and of Jewish especially Jewish women's understandings of Rebekah. Because as with the Hebrew Scriptures as a whole, these narratives are not straightforward. Those who've examined them say they're quite long, actually, for something which is about a woman. Maybe they come from women's stories themselves, but they've been obviously shaped by the people who wrote them. And that's precisely their glory and their invitation. Like all the scriptures that we have, they're an invitation because they're actually uneven. They're not settled. They're not propaganda. They're not ideology. If they were, we would see through them. But they're actually something that is very human as well as something that bears the divine. Because they come to us from very different contexts to our own, with ambiguous human figures whose stories are told from particular perspectives which are not usually our own. And that's why they're helpful, not because they fit into our ideas, but because they don't. Because what the Bible does, and Christian tradition and other traditions do, is provide us with what we would call, and scholars have called, horizons of difference, as well as horizons to which we can identify. So they last as inspirational literature because they are not just mirrors in which we see ourselves, but if things are challenging us, maybe they challenge us to grow and to deepen, even the uncomfortable ones as well as the surprising ones. Because God speaks because of their very human moral ambiguities, not despite them. And that's what happens in our own lives too. So let me therefore offer briefly 3 renewing aspects of Rebekah. Each is strongly affirmed by Jewish female scholarship and is a gift to us all. Indeed, I don't know about you, but it's almost always helpful to check out what the Jews have to say when we're a little perplexed about Hebrew scriptures. After all, they've argued, and if you know the Jews at all, they argue about every text. You know the famous thing, there's 2 Jews together and you get at least 3 opinions. That's what we're invited to do. So when you have these scriptures, treat them like the Jews do and listen to what the Jews have to say, especially what the women have to say, because that's pretty important. Whenever you look at a woman's perspective, how about talking to the women of what they might have to say? First off, Rebekah reminds us that God has... Sometimes, I know you'd say, well, do I really need to say this in the United Church? Well, frankly, I do still. Because God has always worked powerfully through women as well as men. And it's not just women fitting into men's thing, because women do something to change the course of history. Don't just fit into someone else's patterns. That's core to our faith, even when it's been honoured in the breach, and it has a lot. We know that. Yes, patriarchal power has been very significant in Christianity and Judaism, but it's not the whole story. And that's what we have to celebrate, especially when we have this great figure of Rebekah. Typically, key moments in the history of the people of faith are shaped or inspired by women. We could go on with them, couldn't we? Mary, all the rest. And other gendered people, the eunuchs and others. In affirming this, we do not help ourselves, therefore, I think, by simply calling the Genesis and other Hebrew texts stories of the patriarchs or patriarchal narratives, which is what is often expressed even by quite liberal and progressive writers. Rebekah's story shatters that, just as it shatters the oft-repeated line about our faith being a faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is just the leading men. There's a reason why Rebekah's story is told at length at Genesis, because it proclaims the power of God that comes through women in living Jewish and Christian faith. So I think we ought to speak about the patriarchal and matriarchal narratives. We might also consider speaking of the faith of Abraham, Rebekah, and Jacob. Because it is not Isaac who really gives us second-generation leadership here, it is Rebekah. Isaac seems to be, on the whole, quite a decent kind of guy, a little bit weak perhaps, but we're even told that he loves Rebekah. It's quite astounding, because you rarely hear in the Bible that supposedly heterosexual heroes love, well, anyone sometimes, but love their women. Such modern companionate romantic ideas are hard to find in the Bible, at least among straight people. David and Jonathan, Ruth and Naomi, yes, but where do we hear about straight people loving one another? So Isaac actually is worth reflecting upon. But Isaac is clearly not the powerful and what we call in the northeast of England the canny man that we see in Abraham or Jacob. So the mantle, as Abraham perceives it, and Abraham's in this story prompting to go and find someone who can take forward the faith and the people and the culture, because Isaac isn't going to do it well enough. It has to go through Jacob ultimately via Rebekah, not through Isaac or Esau. So you see why Jewish women have never been pushovers. I don't know how many Jewish women you know, but seriously, even in the Orthodox, the women make big input. Because the faith and blessing of God in Rebekah typically flows through them and through all Christian women and others who take up the mantle of this great elder of faith. That's who Rebekah is, an elder of faith. Secondly, Rebekah's prominence in Genesis reveals the kind of resources that we are called upon to share. And this comes, I think, especially from Rebekah's groundedness in her own culture. Now, we can view this story, I said last week, this is a tribal book. This is a tribal story. Think of it in those terms. Think of it. What's happening here is that if you leave Isaac to it, Abraham's people become assimilated. Not a good word in Australia for indigenous people. You become assimilated into the culture. So what Abraham has done by drawing in Rebekah here is to reinvigorate the culture, to tell the stories, to tell the songs, to sing the songs, to bring the life and the values right at the heart of the second and third generation of the people. Because at this point, Abraham's people were a fragile migrant band in alien circumstances. Arranged marriage, therefore, might seem strange to modern Westerners, not to a lot of people in our world, but Rebekah's marriage was vital to help them reconnect and renew their culture, their faith, and the deepest values that motivated their people. Because Rebekah not only brought new literal wealth to the struggling tribe, but also deep cultural strength. You can see that in how Rebekah's generosity is manifest in the way that she not only offers water to Abraham's men, but thinks about their animals and their band and everything else that they might need as well. Because through Rebekah, the Abraham tribe draws not only literally, but spiritually and symbolically on the wells of life itself. Thirdly, and most powerfully, in both Jewish and pre-Reformation Christian thinking, Rebekah is a figure for the role of humanity as a whole in God's purposes. Might be a little bit tricky if you're a bit too over the top with Calvinism, but human beings have a role in God's work of grace. Jewish scholarship offers us the concept of tikkun, or repair. That's the job of human beings, tikkun, repair. Repair the things that have gone wrong. And I think it's a lovely way of understanding Rebekah and Jacob's pushing aside of Esau. This is the Jewish perception, tikkun, that whilst we recognize God's overall sovereignty and grace, human beings have an active role in that power of grace, in healing the world and its ills and redirecting it along God's path. So what is suggested by Jewish scholarship is that Rebekah is, as it were, a kind of new Eve. You know how Eve and Adam lost the plot and they ended up and all the consequences. She's a new giver of life, as it were. And if you analyze, as Hebrew scholars do, the language of both the Garden of Eden story and the Rebekah and Esau stories, you find that a lot of the language and the structure are the same. That's truly significant for Hebrews and Jews, and it should be for us too. So what the wise and resourceful Rebekah is doing is to intervene in repairing the divine pathway which is going wrong. Esau, and this is part of the problem, Esau, frankly, would be a complete disaster to lead this struggling, needy people. I mean, he's quite an admirable man in his own way. He's strong and he's good at hunting and everything else. But everyone knows that it won't work, including Esau himself. He might be a good hunter, but much more is required in leadership, let's face it, than a self-concerned macho man. And if political history and recent political history hasn't taught us that, so what Rebekah finds in her son, significantly, who spends a lot of time in the women's tents. There's lots of gender sexuality stuff in that possibly, but the point is that Jacob is a person for all of the people, not just for Esau-type people. So what Rebekah's trickery, as it were, does is to put God's people back on track. It's going to career right off like it did under Trump and Bolsonaro and all the other macho men. Back through this, yes, slightly dodgy fox called Jacob, but on the way forward back into the culture and the values and the things that really matter. So instead of offering the wrong food like the apple, Eve to Adam, Rebekah offers other food, savory food. And the language, as I say, is quite similar in the Hebrew. And therefore they secure the blessing for Jacob. Now, as I say, all of that's a bit strange to us, isn't it, if we read it in a surface way. But when you delve down a bit and when you talk to the Jews about it, it makes a bit more sense. It's still a bit odd. It's still a bit queer. But then why would we want to think that the extraordinary principle of primogeniture, leadership of the firstborn, I am a firstborn, so I can say this. I know we've just had our king, Charles. He's got there because of primogeniture and everything else. But it's a bit bonkers, isn't it? Let's face it. God doesn't work. This is what Rebekah's story tells us, and lots of other stories in the Bible. Doesn't work in straight lines. Sorry. Sometimes you need a little intervention, a little tikkun, a little healing, a little repairing. That's what Rebekah does. Queer, as it might seem to others, not quite straight. We must indeed be careful with books, especially those in the Bible, with great potential for good and evil. So what I'm saying is how we handle books is vital. Maybe if we handle them with the kind of generosity of spirit and resourcefulness we see in Rebekah, we may do a little bit better for ourselves and others. Because as our gospel today says, in conclusion, God is constantly speaking to us, calling us to dance. Sometimes that voice is speaking in very strange, even discomforting ways, and we may find ourselves challenged, even by the Bible. But as Jesus says, God's yoke, God's call, is easy. So neither the Bible nor anything else in Christian faith is meant to be a burden on us, or a means in which we burden others. Rather, we're invited into a dance of discovery, into a feast of love, like the kind of feast that Rebekah put on for her people, taking up the tunes passed down to us, and like Rebekah, maybe playing a few new notes, or transposing, as a wonderful man up there, Alexis, can do with his gifts, to take music and change it to make sure that the tune and the song can continue, sharing both the wisdom of our inherited faith and new waters of life. This we pray for in Jesus' name. Amen.